Good evening, everyone. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, we thank you for attending tonight's Lecture Me Talk of the 2023-24 season. My name is James Malinowski, and I am the Community Engagement Officer in the Experiential Education Unit within the Office of the Vice Principal, Academic, and Dean at UTM. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Ken Derry, who will be delivering a talk entitled We Are Our Stories, Healing and Indigenous Films from the Department of Historical Studies. Professor Derry is the grandson of 4 immigrants to Toronto from Wales and England, growing up in Rexdale and Mississauga. He is the first person in his family to receive a post-secondary education. He arrived at U of T in 1985 to study biophysics, but an elective course on religion and literature in his second year changed his life. He loved it so much that he left science behind to study the ways in which traditional forms of religion relate to modern secular stories. What might the Bible tell us about Iron Man, for example, and vice versa? Professor Derry completed his doctorate at U of T on religion and violence in contemporary Indigenous literature in Canada. He has published many essays on religion, literature, and film, and co-edited The Myth Awakens, the first book about Star Wars by scholars of religion. As a professor, Professor Derry has worked to help make the university a more supportive, equitable, and welcoming space. He contributed to U of T's Truth and Reconciliation Report and aims to responsibly incorporate Indigenous perspectives, stories, histories, and ways of knowing into all his courses. Professor Derry's concern for students' learning and well-being has been recognized with numerous awards over the years, including the 2023 3M National Teaching Fellowship, Canada's highest teaching honor. Professor Derry loves cats, roti, and biking in Toronto, which he has done for 40 years with only one minor accident. It was entirely his fault. Over to you, Professor Derry.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Now, technology concerns worry me a bit because I'm going to use a fair bit of it tonight. So we'll see how it goes. Right. So hopefully folks can see that. So technologically, we're going to start off low-key, just with some text, and then build up to some videos and sound. And James is giving me a thumbs up, so I hope that means that the slide is coming through. Okay. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about this word. It's kind of important. There are a few topics that are sort of incorporated in this talk that could be talks all by themselves, and we don't have time for that. But I want to flag at least a couple of them, and this is the first one, obviously. So what do we mean by Indigenous, or what do I mean by Indigenous? So literally, the word means original, so original to a place, typically. In terms of how I'm using it and how it's often used in North America, it tends to mean someone or a group of people who have links to communities that were in Canada or North America or Turtle Island before the arrival of Europeans. That is a kind of, in some ways, a huge oversimplification of the term. The issue of whether or not, or the question of whether or not somebody or a community is Indigenous is still constantly being kind of debated and argued, and it involves all kinds of important issues like land rights, for example, or there are famous individual cases where someone has said that they are Indigenous and sometimes reaps certain kinds of benefits from this, and then sometimes that identity is questioned. So one of the more famous cases in Canada is the writer Joseph Boyden. And then a couple of years ago, a filmmaker named Michelle Latimer also, there were questions about her identity and whether or not the claim she was making for connections to community could be substantiated. And the questions were sort of raised by the community that she said she was connected to. But yeah, it's definitely a complicated topic in many ways. One other issue with this term is that it generalizes a number of people and communities that are quite diverse and different from one another. And so that's a problem. There are some advantages that some Indigenous people talk about of this generalization. It can create connections between communities, and it can strengthen Indigenous concerns and different kinds of struggles that individual communities have, where if they come together under this larger umbrella of being Indigenous, they can have more of a voice and more of a say and stronger political sort of position. But it's still important to keep that in mind, that it's a huge overgeneralization. And also, there are a lot of other terms that get used to refer to Indigenous people broadly. One term that I feel very uncomfortable with, but that is often used by Indigenous people, is the term Indian, and you will hear that in at least one of the clips tonight. So those are sort of preliminary comments about that term. And then related to that in some ways is the fact that I am not Indigenous by any of the definitions. As James mentioned, my grandparents all came from England, Ireland, or Wales. So I don't have a connection to communities in that sense. Where it begins for me is when I started my PhD research, and I was led to think about Indigenous literature in Canada. Then when I started teaching religion and film, I started to become exposed to some Indigenous films and to incorporate them into my classes. In 2016, as part of my job as an editor at the Journal of Religion and Film, I was asked by the larger editor. I'm a small editor, so the big E editor of the journal asked me if I would do some reviews at the Toronto International Film Festival, which I had not done before, and I'd only sort of sporadically attended the film festival. So I decided to focus my viewing and my reviews on Indigenous movies at the festival, and that really, for me, that was a real change. I started to become aware of many more Indigenous movies than I had been aware of before. And every year, like, so many come out, and they're kind of amazing. And then in 2018, I was asked to teach a course on Indigenous films at U of T. So I've been doing that every year since 2018, and that again has sort of really ramped up my exposure and my understanding. And in many ways, the talk tonight comes out of my teaching experience much more than my research experience. So it's informed by my research, but it really comes out of teaching. Okay, so this is what I want to talk about. A quick overview of Indigenous films in Canada. I want to talk about sort of the main theoretical piece that I'm going to use today, which is a book called Taking Back Our Spirits, and then discuss 3 films. I ended up making a small change to the way I conceived of the talk. Initially, I was only going to talk about Indigenous films made in Canada, but as I'll discuss, the film Smoke Signals is so important and so central to any conversation about Indigenous movies that I thought I should actually start there. So hopefully that's okay with everyone. Okay, so Indigenous films in Canada. One thing I want to mention is that Canada is actually quite unique when it comes to Indigenous films. And one of the reasons is because of the Aboriginal People's Television Network. So this began in a slightly different form in 1992 as TVNC, and then in 1999 was renamed the Aboriginal People's Television Network and obtained a national license. And it's actually the first national Indigenous broadcast network anywhere in the world. And this created a culture of Indigenous media production and skilled and trained folks who can do a variety of things when it comes to film production. So, not just writing and directing, but, the key grip, for example, or set design. And so this has been a really a really important aspect of Indigenous media production in Canada. And Canada, given its relative size, I mean, we're not that big, obviously, in many ways compared to other countries, and that includes the Indigenous population. I think we Indigenous filmmakers here are overrepresented in many ways in global Indigenous cinema. So I'm just going to just run through a few quick posters. So I'm not going to talk about these films. So there's the poster for Smoke Signals. I put these two first just because Smoke Signals is the first mainstream film that was made entirely by Indigenous people. So the writers, directors, and again, the crew, all Indigenous, just a few non-Indigenous actors in the movie. And that came out in 1998. This sort of period of Indigenous made cinema is not that old in many ways. In Canada, the first kind of comparable film is Atanarjuat, which came out in 2001. So just 3 years after Smoke Signals, and in some ways represented a huge leap forward in all kinds of ways, which we can talk about later if people want. But it's an Inuit film, and it's entirely in Inuit. So there's no English spoken in the film at all. So everything, if you were an English speaker, you would have to understand the film by reading the subtitles. Probably the first Indigenous made film in Canada that some people would know of. It came out much earlier, which is Kanesatake, 270 Years of Resistance. It's a film by Alanis Obomsawin. It's a documentary about the Oka crisis, which we will actually talk a little bit more about later on today, or I will talk about it. And Alanis Obomsawin is the most prolific Indigenous filmmaker, probably in the world, certainly in Canada. She's made over 50 movies. She's in her 80s now. One of her more recent films is Our People Will Be Healed. And I saw that movie at TIFF, and she happened to sit in front of me. So I was very excited when I saw her come in and sit in front of me. And she was kind of amazing. She's very tiny and just filled with energy. And I think she had just turned 80 that year. And when the screening was over, she went to go on the stage to do a Q&A, and she went to literally jump up onto the stage, and the organizers seemed very concerned. And they sort of, successfully convinced her not to jump on the stage and just to walk up the stairs. And so she did that instead. Documentary Real Injun, which is worth watching to get a sense of the representations of Indigenous people in mostly Hollywood film. It's mostly about movies made by non-Indigenous people, and kind of ends with movies like Atanarjuat. Falls Around Her, we'll talk about today. These are two movies made by Mi'kmaq director Jeff Barnaby. They're both really great in lots of ways. Sadly, Jeff Barnaby died not that long ago. He's quite young, died of cancer. Edge of the Knife, or Skawe Kuna, is a Haida film. So it's the only feature film entirely in the Haida language. And then these are just a few other fairly prominent Indigenous films from Canada. And it's a range of genres. And then I wanted to mention this film festival. Part of what I hope people get from this talk is just an awareness of Indigenous films that exist, because they're kind of amazing. Those of you who aren't familiar with Indigenous movies, and I want to say a word about Imaginative, kind of in the same spirit. So this is a film festival that takes place in Toronto every fall. It's been going on for over 20 years now. It's the largest Indigenous film festival in the world. So again, connecting back to the history of APTN in Canada and the production of films, Indigenous films in this country. So the two sets of dates there, 17th to the 22nd, those are in-person screenings, and then they have an online version of the festival, and that obviously started during the pandemic, and they've kept it up since then. So a few films. These are all films from Indigenous people in Canada that are showing. That's another Inuit film on the left there. I'm I'm very curious about the film on the left on this slide. It's about the Stanley Cup Vancouver riots, but it's a documentary by Indigenous filmmakers. So I'm very interested to see what the take is on that thing that happened. And then the movie on the right, Hey Victor, I saw that at TIFF, and that's a kind of sequel to Smoke Signals, but not really. It's a very interesting movie in many ways. It's essentially done as a kind of mockumentary. The main character is played by the same actor who plays a young version of the character Victor in Smoke Signals. Okay, so this is the theoretical book that I want to talk about, and part of the reason for talking about this and for using this text is it goes back to my status as a non-Indigenous person. When I look at Indigenous literature and film, generally speaking, I want to sort of try to see it as much as possible through the lens of Indigenous ways of thinking and understanding stories. So Jo-Ann Episkenew, I first knew her work because she talks about literature, and that's where I started. But what she has to say about literature is applicable to other kinds of stories. So yeah, Jo-Ann Episkenew is a Métis scholar, or was a Métis scholar. She also died a few years ago. So this is the sort of main thrust of her book. It's how stories by Indigenous storytellers can help Indigenous people heal from colonial trauma. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. She also makes the point in the text that it's important for settlers, people like me, to know the truth about our history and the truth about how colonialism has impacted Indigenous people and the truth of Indigenous traditions and cultures. And histories. But I'm not going to talk about that today, that second point. I'm going to talk about the first point. And I also want to highlight the fact that there can be a danger in focusing on colonialism when discussing Indigenous stories, because it ends up recentering colonialism rather than Indigenous people. And it also, therefore, can define Indigenous people in terms of colonialism and in terms of trauma. So I don't want to do that. I'm going to try not to do that, but Episkenew's concern with the idea that Indigenous stories can heal, is specifically focused on the trauma suffered from colonialism, or because of colonialism, the ongoing trauma. But that's something we can talk about, whether or not I've talked too much about colonialism today. So the sort of basic premise, this is the title of my talk. The quote comes from Episkenew's book, and she is quoting Joseph Gould, who is a non-Indigenous literary person. And it's a concept that probably all of us are essentially familiar with, although I think many times we can undervalue or underappreciate just what kind of impact stories can have on us. But this idea that the stories we tell about ourselves and our communities, and the stories that others tell about us, essentially end up defining us in lots of ways. Even if we resist them, they still have this huge impact on how we sort of move through the world, how we understand what's important in life, how we understand what our values are, what our purpose is fundamentally, and not just our values, but our value. And that's an important point that comes up specifically in the way that Episkenew talks about this. She connects Gould's point about stories and identity with a number of different Indigenous writers and thinkers, including Thomas King, for example, also a psychologist named Terry Tafoya, who's from the Taos Pueblo Nation, and then also Basil Johnson, who is Anishinaabe storyteller and also linguist. Actually, he did a lot of work on trying to revitalize Anishinaabe-Moan. So this idea that words can be medicine in both positive and negative ways. They can heal or they can harm. And that's kind of crucial, that point that stories and words can have both of these effects. There's a sort of spectrum of impact. So thinking about the impact of stories, Episkenew begins her book by talking about her experience at university, and specifically the fact that um, all of her courses were about European settler traditions, culture, and knowledge. The only time she encountered anything about Indigenous traditions or ways of knowing was in Indigenous studies courses. So they were sort of relegated off to the side. If you took a course on biology, there wasn't a section where they talked about Indigenous understandings of living systems, for example. And I mean that mirrors my experience too. When I was a student, there were no Indigenous texts included in English courses. Soon after I finished my undergraduate degree, they started to be included in courses on Indigenous literature or world literatures in English. Um, uh, but it took a while before you would end up with any Indigenous texts included, just in courses on tragedy or science fiction or something like that. They tended to be marginalized in lots of ways. So the story that she's being taught here is that uh, European settler traditions matter. They're important, they're vital, and Indigenous traditions and ways of knowing do not matter, or don't even really exist when you're not exposed to them at all. So that's a kind of implicit story that's being told, and that mirrors a story that she says Indigenous people they hear throughout their lives, and also non-Indigenous people hear that one kind of knowing and certain traditions exist and matter, and others don't. And what does that do to our sense of ourselves? So then she kind of generalizes. And these are not all the points that she makes, but I'm just giving you a selection of points as a way of starting to think about what some Indigenous films are doing. I mean, in my experience, I think most of them are doing most of these things. So colonial myths, they are stories about the superiority of settlers, particularly European settlers or settlers of European descent, so people like me, and the inferiority of Indigenous people and cultures and so forth. There's a story about how progress is important and good. So progress or modernity or civilization, these things are all very positive. There's a story about how Indigenous people really don't exist anymore. When I was in school, for example, the last time Indigenous people were spoken of was to talk about the rebellion of Louis Riel. So I was actually shocked when I first started my PhD research into Indigenous literature. I read a book by Thomas King, and I thought, this is wonderful. I wish there were more books by Indigenous authors, just assuming that there weren't, because no one had ever talked about them. And then finding there was a host of texts by Indigenous authors. I mean, that was in the mid 90s, and there were already so many books out there. So yeah, my sense was that that people, Indigenous people, kind of barely existed still, and so that's one story that can be very harmful to Indigenous people. It's a way of erasing them. And then the story in Canada, the colonial story of Canada itself as a peaceful country, historically and currently, as a country that's open, that's very kind, and so forth. This is a pretty common story that's told about Canada that Canadians tell ourselves, but that's also told about Canada by outsiders as well. Uh, so Episkenew says that one way in which stories can heal Indigenous people is to push back against these stories. So to push back against all of those ideas, and in ways that bring the truth of both the past and the present to light. So to put this in sort of more affirming ways, um, stories can heal if they humanize European settlers. So the point of the stories isn't to reverse the binary and to say that Indigenous people are better than European settlers, but just to say, we're all people essentially. So European settlers can be flawed, they can be positive or negative in different ways, and so can Indigenous people. To affirm the value, that Indigenous people, cultures, and so forth matter. Again, not that they're superior, but that they have value and worth. to offer criticisms of progress and modernity and so forth, to push back against the vanishing Indian myth by just showing that Indigenous people are here, that they are thriving and resilient, and to acknowledge the violent colonial past and present of this country. So those are the five kind of points that I'm going to be touching on in the next in the three films that I want to discuss. All right, so and I'll go through them pretty quickly. So this is the first one, again, Smoke Signals. That's the writer and the director there. Those are the three main characters. Well, Susie is kind of a minor character, actually. It's mainly about Victor and Thomas. They're the writer and the director. One of the Canadian connections to the film is the fact that all of the main actors, so not Susie, but Victor and Thomas and Victor's parents, they're all actors from Canada. And the actor who plays Thomas, Evan Adams, became a doctor, and he's actually the chief medical officer of First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia. That is his current job. So these are the high points of the plot. So it takes place in the Coeur d'Alene Reservation in Idaho. The story is sort of about the fact that Victor's father, he accidentally caused a fire which killed a couple of people and resulted in trauma that he never quite overcame. He ends up leaving his family, leaving the reservation where they live. Victor grows up with a lot of resentment towards his father, and then gets a call from Susie, who lives in a trailer beside where his dad lived, near Phoenix, that his father has died. So Victor and Thomas take a road trip to Phoenix to retrieve his father's ashes, and they resolve issues along the way. All right. So here's a little bit of Thomas, and I'll explain why I'm showing this to you in a second.
I must have been waiting there for a couple hours, but I just watched the water. It was beautiful. I kept hoping I'd see some salmon, but there ain't any salmon in that river no more.
And that's Victor's father there. So this is a moment that comes up in different ways in different Indigenous films, which is some kind of reference to environmental harm. This in Smoke Signals, it's not really drawn out or made too explicit. But salmon is important in the film in lots of ways, and you'll see this in the next scene that I show. And so the implication here is that there's no salmon in the river because of pollution. So that's one of the common ways in which Indigenous films will criticize progress or modernity. All right, so Victor and Thomas, to get to Phoenix, they take a bus. So this is a really crucial scene that takes place on the bus. It's a conversation between the two friends.
Don't you even know how to be a real Indian?
I guess not.
Oh, shit, no wonder. Jeez. I guess I'll have to teach you then, ain't it? First of all, quit grinning like an idiot. Indians ain't supposed to smile like that. Get stoic. No, like this. You gotta look mean or people won't respect you. White people will run all over you if you don't look mean. You gotta look like a warrior. You gotta look like you just came back from killing a buffalo.
But our tribe never hunted buffalo. We were fishermen.
What? You wanna look like you just came back from catching a fish? This ain't dances with salmon, you know. Thomas, you gotta look like a warrior. There, that's better.
So one of the important things about this scene is that the film makes it clear that Victor is wrong. Victor doesn't know how to be a real Indigenous person, and Thomas is right, in fact. So and this scene itself makes that apparent because Victor talks about looking like you've just killed a buffalo, and Thomas points out that's not who they are. They're historically not buffalo hunters, their community. And so this kind of speaks also to Episkenew's point about stories. And Victor appears to have developed his understanding from movies. So these are the things that he says. So these are cliches about Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous men, to be stoic, not to smile, and so forth. And then he references a Hollywood film when he says, "This ain't Dances with Salmon." So that's a reference to the Kevin Costner film that came out just a few years before Smoke Signals, Dances with Wolves. And so even in that piece, that short bit of dialogue, the film is pointing to the ways in which Hollywood narratives or narratives by non-Indigenous people have shaped Indigenous identity in ways that end up being very harmful and that disconnect them from their history and their culture. And so there's a poster from that film. One of the things that's interesting about this film is that many Indigenous filmmakers actually credit Dances with Wolves, despite it having quite a few shortcomings, with making movies like Smoke Signals possible, because it suggested to studios that there was a market for movies about Indigenous people, or where the Indigenous people played a prominent role. And so it kind of leads to, in some ways, Smoke Signals, which then opens up the door to a host of other Indigenous-made films. Like, it really changed the landscape in many ways. So I'm mostly just going to talk about the bus scene in this film. The other thing that happens on the bus that's really important is that there's a stop and people get off. There's a rest stop, and then they get back on. And these two guys take the seats that Thomas and Victor were sitting in. So this is a clear kind of allusion to colonialism, to white people coming in and taking Indigenous land and territory. And Thomas and Victor end up at the back of the bus. And the fact that Victor is stoic doesn't change any of this. So the whole point about how you have to look mean or white people will walk all over you, they walk all over him anyway, even though he tries to look mean. It makes no difference. And one thing that's important, I think, about this moment is that that comes up kind of often in a lot of Indigenous films, is you will have villains like this in the movie. I mean, this is all that they do. That doesn't escalate at all. But the films often will have a counterpoint, white people who are not jerks, basically. So in Smoke Signals, there's a very nice gymnast that they talk to at one point. And then in a crucial sequence later on in the movie, they meet this man who's a very kind sheriff. And so again, this idea of humanizing European settlers, not demonizing them, not saying that they are worse or all bad or anything like that. But these guys suck, very clearly. And in response, there's a really, to this happening to them, there's a really wonderful scene in Smoke Signals. This is the last, one of the last scenes on the bus here.
Man, the Cowboys always win.
The Cowboys don't always win.
Yeah, they do. The Cowboys always win. Look at Tom Mix. What about John Wayne? Man, he was about the toughest cowboy of them all, innit?
You know, in all those movies, you never saw John Wayne's teeth? Not once. I think there's something wrong when you don't see a guy's teeth. John Wayne's teeth, hey, John Wayne's teeth, hey, 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 hey. John Wayne's teeth, hey, John Wayne's teeth, hey, hey, hey. Are they false? Are they real? Are they plastic? Are they steel? Hey, hey, are they plastic? Are they steel? Ha ha, hey, hey, oh, hey, hey.
There's lots of things happening in that scene that I love. One of them is that Victor smiles, possibly for the first time in the movie in any real sort of genuine way. He's kind of a bully to Thomas, actually, throughout the film until the end. Um, uh, but one of the things that I've noticed in a number of Indigenous movies is that often humor is used to do many of the things that Episkenew is talking about. So here, humor is used to humanize John Wayne. They sort of make fun of him, rather than, sort of, again, demonizing him, which you could do quite easily in many ways, but pushing back against the idolizing of this figure, this colonial figure, and then it also is a way of humanizing the Indigenous characters too, in the eyes of the people watching, if you're particularly if you're not Indigenous. But it shows the sort of this presence of the Indigenous people in the film, and again this notion of thriving. So it's not just about trauma. It's this really, in some ways, positive response to a really, unpleasant situation. But the scene ends with them having voice. They get the last word, not the two guys who take their seats. Okay, I'm going to move on to Beans now. Beans is a film from 2020 from Tracy Deer mostly, and then co-writer Meredith Vuknik. And so that Beans is the name of the main character, and that's who you see in the poster. They're the filmmakers. So Beans is about the Oka crisis from 1990. And if you don't know what that is about, very basically, the town of Oka were expanding a golf course onto Kanesatake territory. And so this was Mohawk territory. And so they went there, many of them, to occupy the territory so that people couldn't build the golf course. The local police, or the Quebec police, were there for a while, and then eventually things escalated and the army moved in. So that's all sort of the historical record. In the film, Beans and her family head to the initial standoff, and then when things start to get much more violent and dangerous, Beans and her younger sister and her mom leave. So they're away when things ramp up between the army and the Mohawk, and also other Indigenous folks who come to support the Mohawk. Eventually, an agreement is reached. That's just historically what happened, and Beans goes home. So that's the basic plot. Tracy Deer, this is a kind of fictional autobiography. Tracy Deer is from this community, and she lived through this. So she was a 12-year-old girl during the Oka crisis, and just as Beans is in the film. So some parts of the film are fictionalized, but some of them are reflections on her own experience during that time. A couple of the clips I'm going to show from Beans, just to warn you, are definitely upsetting. So I'll let you know as I'm about to show something upsetting. But the first thing I'm going to show you is not, I mean, it's kind of upsetting, but it's not terrible. This is actually the first scene of the movie. Her mom is trying to get her into a kind of elite private school. So mostly would be white children in the school. So they're driving to the school at the beginning of the film.
My name is Tigahandakwa.
Tigahandakwa.
Tigahandakwa?
Tigahandakwa.
Tigahandakwa. Or you can call me Beans. Everybody does.
Thank you.
So here, I mean, one of the things we see in this film is, first of all, Beans capitulating, even though she's trying to get the woman to say her Mohawk name. And also, there's a sense in which the woman from the school is being criticized. So this is a subtle way in some ways, or maybe not so subtle, of saying that maybe people who are of European descent aren't always superior if you can't pronounce a word in another language, despite a young girl sounding it out very carefully for you. How superior are you really? And then, so I'm now going to show you the final scene. She gets into the school, and after everything is done with Oka takes place over the summer of 1990. She goes to the school, and so this is her introducing herself. And one of the things you may notice here is what she has on her head, the back of her head. So she's bringing some of her identity into the school, despite the fact that she has to wear this sort of colonial uniform.
My name is Digahandakwa.
So it feels like for me a very powerful affirmation of, again, the value of her Indigenous identity. When her family first goes to the territory that's in dispute, there's a nice scene between the two sisters where they're simply riding their bikes. So the scene, I mean, for me, it reminds me a bit of the John Wayne's Teeth song. It's the two girls having fun and laughing on this disputed territory, and they're claiming it. So this affirmation of their existence and their vitality and their resistance, but framed in this really kind of playful, joyful way. One of the things that's really powerful about the film that Tracy Deer does is she uses news footage from the time. She threads that throughout the movie. And so here's one of the scenes that she does. And this scene, just so you know, contains some profanity.
They come out. You don't care if they die? I don't give a shit if they die.
So one of the reasons, when I first saw this film, Tracy Deer was present, and she spoke afterwards about one of her reasons for including news footage in the movie. And one of those reasons was she didn't want to have actors saying the things that people said in these newsreels because she felt that it wouldn't feel real to them. They might think that she was exaggerating, and she wanted it to be clear what was really going on and the level of hatred and violence from non-Indigenous Canadians. And so this speaks to this idea, again, of pushing back against the idea that Canada's past is peaceful and that its present is peaceful even. So I'm going to show you another scene. This is the most upsetting scene I'm going to show you, actually. This is taking place as Beans and her family are leaving the territory for safety because things have escalated. And as they cross a bridge, there's a bridge, but this scene actually isn't on a bridge. There are just dozens and dozens and dozens of white people throwing rocks at their car. So it's not long, but it's upsetting, and you can sort of look away if you don't want to watch this part. So Tracy Deer has spoken about this as something that happened to her. This is one of the autobiographical moments in the film, and that this experience left her feeling suicidal actually for many years. So this was really, really traumatizing, and putting it in the film was one way for her of dealing with this this trauma. But again, showing that history of violence, colonial violence in this country. And then the last scene to show you is actually, this is the bus that's taking Beans to the school at the end. And you can see, first of all, there's a big sign that says this is Mohawk land. So this affirmation of Indigenous sovereignty and territory and rights. And then something really important happens on the bus. So that's a rock, one of the rocks that was thrown at their car. So she's kept this as a kind of talisman and a reminder of just kind of her place and her relationship to colonial society. I mean, I'm sort of reading into that, but it's definitely a moment that speaks of, again, her resilience and her determination to thrive in the face of this kind of oppression. Okay, last film, Falls Around Her by Darlene Neponce. Darlene Neponce very kindly came to my class a few years ago and spoke about this film with me and students in the course. There she is. So Falls Around Her, it's about a singer named Mary. She's a very famous singer in the film who decides to kind of quit her career and return home. She goes home to her reserve, which is actually where Darlene Neponce is from. She moves into her grandmother's cabin in the forest and slowly starts to rebuild her connections to family, to community, to herself, and to the natural world. That's what most of the film is about. And then there's this kind of small plot that leads to a sort of violent moment at the end of the film where her former manager is trying to force Mary to go on tour again. There's a moment, one of the, again, small plots in the film is that there's a local mine that is poisoning the water. So there's some discussion about this. This is much more explicit than in Smoke Signals, but again, this is one way in which the film is critical of progress. There's Keith at the end. He shows up to force Mary physically to go with him, and he hurts her, and then she fights back. So I'm going to show you the ending of the scene where she fights back, or the ending of the film. She does this, but she has set up some traps for Keith. There's a kind of a bit of a Home Alone aspect to this part of the film. We've seen her setting up these traps. All right, so there Keith goes down. Watching this in some ways was very satisfying. One thing that was interesting was when Neponce came to my class and students talked about the scene, they talked about how much, I mean, they kind of enjoyed seeing Keith, sort of defeated here. And what Neponce said is that she's trying to show, on the one hand, again, that the Euro settler person isn't superior, so he's defeated by Mary. But also, this is a problem because Mary has been aware that somebody is kind of stalking her. There's a problem. She feels there's some danger, which is why she sets the traps, but she never asks for help. And several people offer. They say, are you okay? Can we do anything? And she never asks for help. And one of the things that Neponce talks about, and so does Episkenew, is the ways in which colonial trauma isolates people from one another and sort of splits communities. And so Mary, the fact that she doesn't ask for help is actually a problem. So we're not meant to be too happy that she defeats Keith all by herself. And I have a cat here who's suddenly yelling at me. I don't know if you can hear that. And again, in this film, not all white people are bad. So this is one of Mary's friends, musician friends from before, and they have a nice evening together. He's a very lovely man. A lot of the film is actually quite slow and peaceful. So here's Mary just kind of walking through the woods, actually. So there's a lot of these sorts of moments throughout the movie. Oh, he is visiting. Hi. Oh, all right. So my cat just stepped on on my slides. 1 second. Sorry, I have to go back now. That has not happened before in all the times of the cat coming to visit while I was teaching. Okay, so one of the things that we missed there is that Mary ends up stripping the bark off some birch trees. And so the point is that she's reconnecting with some of her Anishinaabe traditions as she walks through the woods. And here she's doing it again by getting some cedar. And then here's another moment where she's walking through the woods and she sees a little bit of garbage. Now, as it turns out, this is likely left there by Keith as he's sort of watching her for a while. But when it first happens, it just seems like it's garbage. So she knows somebody's been there and that someone who is not being thoughtful about the land. So she takes out a pouch. And what she's doing is she's putting tobacco down. And so tobacco and cedar are both medicines, Anishinaabe medicines. So this is one way in which the film is affirming the value of Indigenous traditions, but it's doing it very quietly. It's not drawing attention to this. So this is something that would only be really sort of picked up on by mostly Indigenous viewers. So this is another example. This is another character. And what we see in the background is a sweat lodge frame. So no one talks about it. There's no sweat lodge scene in the film. It's just there. So a sweat lodge is often used for healing ceremony. So again, part of a traditional practice. So there's a sweat lodge frame, and then that's one example of what it might look like. And then lastly, in this vein, when Mary is setting things up, the traps for Keith, she also creates a little warning system by hanging these little metal cones under the stairs so that she can hear somebody approaching. And I completely missed this, actually. Our liaison librarian, Yayo Mutsubo, she asked Darlene DePonce if these were the same kind of cones that are used in jingle dresses, which are dresses for ceremonies and powwows and for healing ceremonies. And she said, yes, absolutely, that's what that is. So again, these little sort of moments of pointing to Indigenous culture and the value of the culture. All right, and then I'm going to end with a final scene of joy and laughter and happiness. This is Mary and her sister and her niece singing and dancing.
Lightning coming from a child, stars one and all, oh sisters, brothers, and all together, aim straight, stand tall.
So that song is by Buffy Sainte-Marie. It's from 1976, and it's a song. The lyrics point to, again, some Indigenous traditional elements like burning sweetgrass. It's also about resilience and pushing back, and it's the first song that that Buffy Sainte-Marie made where she said she was creating a new genre of music called powwow rock. And that's it. So that's just a summary of the key points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ken. Before we start the Q&A, I would just like to apologize for some disrespectful chat lines. We have had to remove the chat. The library and the university do not tolerate this disrespectful behavior. So because there's no chat line tonight, there is on the bottom of the screen on the right-hand side, there's a Q&A, a little question mark. If you want to leave a question there, we'll attend to it and we'll answer it as best we can. So right now, Ken, nobody has been in and put in a question because it's all new technology to them. I just want to mention that as a librarian a few years ago, there were a lot of studies done about how fiction grows emotional intelligence. And that's what I kept thinking about when I was listening to you talking about this. So it usually pertains to books, fiction, but it's films as well. And it leads not only to healing, but to growth. Have you, in your studies, have you thought about that?
Only through this lens. I mean, Episkenew is drawing from many of those kinds of studies in her work. So her point is that this applies broadly, and she's sort of using it specifically in an Indigenous context. It's not something that I've thought about outside of the kinds of things that I was talking about tonight, though. But I'm very sorry to hear about the chat. I'm thankful that I didn't see any of it. That would have been a little distracting.
Yes, yeah. It doesn't pertain to your talk at all. It was just disrespectful. I'm not seeing any other questions come up, but to our participants, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand. There's a little symbol beside the reaction if you raise your hand, and we can get you to speak. We can enable that for you. The other thing I was thinking about when I was listening to you talk, Ken, was just this past week, I've been listening to music by an Inuk artist called Elisapie. I don't know if you've heard of her.
No.
But she is doing music. She's doing pop favorites, and she's translating them into Inuk. But what's really fascinating is she's doing videos, and it's the old documentaries about the Inuk when they were free up in the north
Oh,
before
neat.
before they moved in. And it is so moving, so very heart-rending to see those people. So not just fiction, but nonfiction as well is so important in film.
And also, I mean, the one singer that I know is Tanya Tagaq, who's probably the most famous Inuit singer. She's a throat singer, and it often raises different kinds of issues. So she's received some criticism from her own community because she's not performing throat singing in a traditional way. Traditionally, it's two women throat singing to each other, essentially. But she's of the sort of mindset that, you know, traditions change and grow. And so the question is, you know, what kinds of changes and to what extent can be embraced. So many Indigenous filmmakers, for example, talk about filmmaking as a sort of extension of traditional Indigenous storytelling. I haven't seen any Indigenous criticisms of Indigenous filmmaking, sort of per se, but it's another example of sort of using modern technology to tell stories in ways that connect in some ways to more traditional storytelling forms.
Yes. Okay, now we have some questions. So first question is, do you have a favorite Canadian Indigenous film that you think everyone should watch?
Oh gosh, I really I really love Falls Around Her a lot. I picked my two favorite, basically, Beans and Falls Around Her. They're both really wonderful. Yeah, I like them both a lot. And I mean, it's interesting, the student responses. I haven't used Beans in a class, but I've used Falls Around Her for a while now, and many students struggle with the pace. And this is true of many Indigenous films. Often the pace is quite slow compared to mainstream Hollywood films, which I really, really enjoy. I didn't know that I would like that, but I really like it. I like watching scenes of Mary just walking through the woods. It's really quite lovely. But yeah, those two scenes, I mean, Beans is remarkable. Yeah, they're both outstanding movies.
And do you have a longer list of films that you couldn't fit into the slides?
Oh, I mean, the next film I would have talked about would have been the documentary Our People Will Be Healed by Alanis Obomsawin. That would have been nice. I also really like Rhymes for Young Ghouls by Jeff Barnaby, which is a film from about 10 years ago now. And it's kind of about residential schools, but in a really interesting way. Jeff Barnaby was a big fan of 1970s American horror films, and his film is set in the 70s, and it has that kind of vibe to it. Yeah, it's really quite wonderful, but it's definitely more violent and profane than other films that I've talked about today.
Okay, any other films you want to mention?
Oh,
I think people are taking notes of what.
yeah. Gosh, there's so many. I mean, Real Engine as a documentary. Real Engine you can see for free, by the way, on the NFB website. So if you just Google Real Engine, REEL, and then INJUN, Real Engine, and NFB, you'll probably get to it. That's really quite. That's a fantastic movie. It's really funny and it's interesting and upsetting. It's great. The Grizzlies is an interesting film. I really quite like it. It has a little bit of a different sort of pedigree in that the producers are Indigenous, but the writer and director are not. But it's been really embraced by a lot of Indigenous folks as kind of authentic in a sense. And it gets a lot of things right. And it's a good film, I think, in a lot of ways. Gosh, what else? Jeff Barnaby's other film, Blood Quantum, if you like horror movies, is wonderful. It's a zombie movie, so different kind of genre. And Night Raiders is a science fiction Indigenous film, which is quite good. So it sort of depends maybe on the kinds of films that people like. But these are all yeah, movies that I really enjoy. And yeah, I've really come to enjoy these movies a lot. Like when I started watching them kind of more intensely, starting in 2016, I was so drawn to them. And one of the reasons why I really like them, like the feature films, the sort of fictional films, one thing that's really interesting about them for me is that they often don't follow standard kind of story arcs. So if you're watching a typical film, like if it's a romantic comedy, you have a sense of the beats and where it's going to go. And even if the ending, it doesn't quite, even if it's a little surprising, like maybe the couple doesn't end up together, which I think is what happens in My Best Friend's Wedding. You know that's the question that has to be resolved. Are they together or not together? And often, like in Falls Around Her, I had no idea where the movie was going. And in some ways, it kind of doesn't go anywhere. It builds towards this confrontation with Keith in a way, but that's not really what most of the film is about. It's kind of Mary figuring herself out and hanging out with people. It's really quite nice, right? It's such a different kind of film to watch. There's a wonderful Australian film, actually. I didn't talk about other Indigenous films, but there's an Australian film that's one of my all-time favorites called Goldstone, which you can rent pretty cheap, and it's a kind of noir detective movie, but again, really slow. It takes place in the outback, lots of long shots of people just driving, and it's there's a mystery there. There's a young woman has disappeared. He's trying to find out what happened to her, and there are bad guys and all of that. But so the sort of standard elements, but it just moves in a really different way, and the point of it is also quite different in a sense. It's not just about sort of putting people in jail, which often doesn't happen in that person's films. The fellow who makes it, this guy named Ivan Sen. Anyway, yeah, there's so many. Yeah, I could talk about it for quite a while.
Yeah, we need a film list, obviously. Adriana in the Q&A chat line, sorry, not chat line, is recommending a few movies. One, Kissed by Lightning by Shelley Nero.
Yeah, that's good.
And The Incredible 25th Year of Mitzi Bearclaw.
Oh, I haven't seen that one.
And a new one at Imaginative this year is Cafe Daughter.
Yes.
She says
that's
all
based
great
on the
stories.
play. Yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to see Cafe Daughter, but that's quite well known. It's been a play for a while. But Kissed by Lightning is really good. I actually, just before the talk, I was thinking, oh, I should have put that poster on my slides of posters, but I didn't have enough time to, yeah, it kind of came to mind a bit late.
Okay. There's a question from Mary about what your students think of the film. So you're watching your students watch the films. How did they react?
It's hard to know. I mean, I only know what they tell me. I don't know how candid they are. I mean, they tend to say very positive things. I guess the two things that seem true in terms of the reactions. One is that they do sometimes bring up the fact that the pace is slow, and I will warn them in advance. I'll say, the pace is slow, so that they know. But they still say, "Oh gosh," So they will tell me sometimes that they watch it on a faster speed because it's too slow for them. So I get that sometimes. But some students actually talk about how they enjoy that pace. The other way in which I see them responding is just very thoughtfully. So I'll pretty much in every case, if I've assigned a film, the first time we meet, I will just ask for their responses to the film, and they will always say really, really thoughtful things, and often they will be surprised by parts of the film. So things like, I talked about today the violent history of Canada's past, which shows up in a number of these films. They will be really kind of shocked by that. In Real Engine, they show scenes like there's a really horrifying scene with John Wayne that they show from one of his films, and students don't know a lot of those movies, the sort of Hollywood westerns they haven't seen, and so they find that really shocking. So sometimes there's that reaction. They're shocked at what they're learning. So the Episkenew's point about learning about that kind of violent past is it's something that I see that in the film is really affecting many of the students. I remember I haven't, as I said, I haven't used beans in a class, but I have put it on a list of films that students can choose for assignments, and so quite a few students have seen Beans, and that's a film that really affects the students who watch it, because again, that they don't know about the ochre crisis typically, and that footage is really powerful. That news footage that Tracy Deer includes in the movie.
Yes.
Thanks, Mary.
Tom asked an interesting question about environmental motifs in Indigenous films, both in Canada and the Americas. And he mentioned Taika Waititi, who is Maori.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, I'm just reading the question here. And he's now directing film like Iron Man. I'm not sure what that means. His final question in a very long question is, do environmental motifs always have to be a theme in Indigenous films?
Oh, definitely not. Yeah, lots of films don't have them, but they do crop up. And even when they crop up, I'm actually kind of more surprised at how often they're subtle. So Falls Around Her is very direct, but Smoke Signals is kind of more typical, where there's just this kind of illusion, like there used to be fish in the river and now there aren't, and then the movie moves on. It's not dwelled on, so it's there, but it's not a focus. That's pretty common, and often it's not there at all. So yeah, it shows up, but not always. Yeah, Taika Waititi is directing some Marvel superhero films, so he's directed a couple of the Thor movies. So that might be the Iron Man reference.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. And his last film, which I saw at TIFF, his most recent film, which is called Next Goal Wins, is really quite wonderful. And I don't think there's any environmental themes in that movie explicitly or even implicitly.
Okay. We're coming to the end of our time here, but the very last thing in the Q&A is not a question. It's a huge Chimagwich, Ken.
Oh, you're welcome.
It says this was a great event.
I'm glad.
Yeah, so that's it. Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. This brings us to the end of our program tonight. We'll be back on November 7th, and I hope that you can join us. Good night, everybody.